I'm already having so much fun. This is great. I'm really loving the vibe right now, and it's making me really so thrilled to be here. I'm going to start the timer because I want to make sure I don't go over time. I tend to ramble sometimes, so let me just
You're
start my
most
fun.
welcome to go over time.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. But I want to start by thanking you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here, especially to Ms. Rahu for all the organization and Dr. Gajala for organizing and having me be able to share some of my thoughts. I also am not an expert in AI, so I'm coming at this from a very particular perspective, and I really look forward to the conversations. I also want to give a shout out to my co-op student, Maya Kojuwaku, who they did all the slides, and I'm very thankful for these slides because they have so many layers to them, and I'm just thrilled. So I'm going to be sharing some thoughts today on the long history of gendered regimes in media and how these pertain to current discussions around gender representation in AI. I come to this topic largely as a media historian. I've been tracking and studying media and countercultural media in particular throughout my career, and this includes looking at feminist media from the 19th century onwards. So there's certainly significant changes in technology over the last 200 years, but the way in which gender is presented or represented through different technological regimes is actually fairly consistent, as are the forms of resistance that emerge to counter or disrupt it. So one of the things that I want to underscore today is that, and I think this has already been discussed earlier in the introductions, technology is a tool. And it's one that emerges in very particular contexts and that is deeply informed by the power dynamics of those contexts. So we need to always be asking who gets access to the technology, what can they use it for, and what forms of using it become dominant and hegemonic or institutionalized, and what forms are erased in official histories. I think these are really important questions. Because within this line of questioning, you're always going to be able to find power operating to amplify something and make something else invisible. And so I think we always need to be critical of what is being amplified and always seek what has been rendered unseeable. So, next slide. Okay. I have long paid attention to what is made invisible in the histories of art, visual culture, and media. This usually includes me looking at the work of women and women of color, queer and racialized communities, because all of these communities have rich histories of using media technologies to resist, to represent lived experiences, and to tell stories that are not taken up in dominant cultural spaces. And this includes using the same tools and technologies that we often criticize for how they underserve and misrepresent these same communities. In my talk today, I want to explore the histories of gender representation in media and memes to help think about gender regimes upheld by AI. So the Oxford definition of regimes is a system or planned way of doing things, especially one imposed from above. The term makes a lot of sense in relationship to discussing technology, which is itself a regime or a planned system. It's imposed from a technological ethos centered on the worldview of the creators and investors of that technology. Currently, this includes what is quickly becoming known as the oligarchy in the US, where a concentrated number of oligarchical empires also hold concentrated amounts of political clout that directly impact the freedom and rights of many different marginalized communities and targeted communities, including queer communities, Black and racialized communities, immigrant communities, women, trans, and working class communities. So when we're considering technological regimes that uphold systems of power, it's useful to think about how AI is also participating in this on many, many levels, especially around gender and racial bias in AI image generators. A 2023 Bloomberg study found that in its analysis of 5,000 images created by the image generator software Stable Diffusion, that in quotes, it takes racial and gender disparities to extremes that are worse than those that are found in the real world of representation. The study prompted Stable Diffusion, so Bloomberg did the study that prompted Stable Diffusion to generate images around job titles and crime. And the 7 job titles that are considered high paying within the US were dominated by subjects with white or light skin tones. And subjects with darker skin tones were more commonly generated by prompts like fast food worker and social worker. Further, for each image depicting a woman, Stable Diffusion generated almost 3 times as many images of men, with most occupations in the data set being dominated by men, except for lower paying jobs like housekeeper and cleaner. A New York Times article, also from 2023, highlights how Black artists exploring AI image generation have noticed explicit racial bias including that some AI technologies distort or ignore the text prompts by the artists. And so this is affecting how Black people are depicted in the images, and also how it's producing certain stereotypes or also censoring different kinds of Black history and culture. So my experimentation with AI image generators has shown something very similar with gender. And here are some images that I did last week on Stable Diffusion. So at the bottom, we have the term feminist, and it kind of moves upwards. Feminist professor. Professor is the two men in the white lab coats. Philosopher is the incredibly weird men in fantasy situations. I'm guessing Philosopher King was kind of what was being imagined by the Stable Diffusion at that point. And then it goes up, there's trad wife. I'm always really interested in the way image generators produce trad wife, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But also at the top is pretty woman and ugly woman. So that's what the generator showed me. The quick takeaway for me, every time I do this exercise with different technologies or different image generators, and I'll show you some examples later on, is that there are no blonde feminists. Trad wife does not mean what we mean it to say in Western vernacular at the moment. If you don't specify a gender, intellectual images will come back male. If you put women and anything about thinking together, it will often include glasses, and I'm going to explain why I think that is in a minute. So my point in all of this is that this isn't really different from any prior media regimes and their gender politics. This includes the history of painting, visual art, cinema, photography, and performance. So take, for instance, a couple of examples, one being the fact that both photographic and cinematic film stocks have never been designed to capture any skin color other than white with any visual accuracy. The same actually can be said for digital surveillance cameras and AI recognition, which struggle to accurately capture faces that are non-white in their skin tone today. So this hasn't changed over 200 years. Another example then is with the slide shown here, thinking about the eugenics-informed kind of histories of photography in the late 19th century, where scientists believed that you could determine things like the criminal predisposition of women based on their ear shape or forehead. So a lot of photography was used by scientists to determine head shapes in order to decide whether someone had criminality or not. So little has changed, I would say, and suggests the ongoing need to address the failings of our technological regimes. And yet discussions about gendered representation and any new technologies need to be paired with a healthy curiosity for how these technologies are reemployed in ways that run counter to these regimes. So what I want to consider is both today, and hopefully this will leave us as a group with a healthy curiosity for how we can tactically use technologies that are tied to harmful power dynamics in productive and more socially just ways. So I'll start then with this meme. I really love the meme on the left on the screen by the artist S. Wild for the account at Ruminations of the Wild, which plays on the horrors persist genre of memes that originated with the meme on the right. So I love the jaunty little green hat and cape. I love the, ungendered opossum, the tactility of the illustration, the life springing forth in the flowers. To me, it's vibrant and hopeful in its resistance. And I actually think that if you were to create this image with an AI prompt, I'm not convinced it would capture the same level of whimsy or the refusal that I think exists in the composition. The origins of the meme that you can see on the right with the guinea pig and pink heart sunglasses is also in itself a playful kind of treatment of absurdism mixed with a certain set of gendered formal codes. It's got this pink, soft filter, a sparkly glow, and this kind of reflecting a girlish mood that I think is appealing in its unseriousness. So this, like the drawn version, offer these kind of spots of joy alongside the recognition of the horrors, and notes that while the horrors persist, so do we in all of our resplendent and perhaps feminine glory. And the meme with the guinea pig suggests that the very things, the sparkly, the unserious, the whimsical, the absurd, that are rejected in our masculinist and patriarchal culture are perhaps what we actually need to ensure our perseverance despite the horrors. So internet memes I'm going to take a minute here to talk about memes before getting into the history. Internet memes are defined as digital content that can rapidly be remixed and circulated across online platforms in ways that impact our social frameworks and communication behaviors. Memes are an ideological practice that provides some form of critique on culture, and that's from Bradley Wiggins. So here we see Xena Princess Warrior being remixed, and this is an image macro meme. So we've got image plus text. And so in a meme remix, Xena Princess Warrior, whether you know about the show or not, you see an angry warrior woman. And it's tied with an activist slogan, no justice, no peace. So these memes often take the form, according to Kyle Perry, of a piece or a series of recognizable uses of media that are readily shared, transformed, and performed in online spaces by communities of users. So in my research, this includes this kind of standard image macro meme, but also hashtags, viral images, videos, reels, TikTok, dances, duets, stitches, themed slide carousel decks, and phrases coming out of digital culture. I have Gen Alpha kids, and so I hear a lot about Riz, which for me is a vernacular meme example. So even in our language, we're participating in memes, and this is all kind of digitally oriented. So importantly for me then is that memes are a genre of online communication, but they're also artifacts of digital culture that connect people and events, forming mimetic communities based on shared interests, identities, and affects. So I want to look at this second meme. This is the first meme that was ever posted by the Instagram account for artist Annalise Hoffmeyer, who goes by the handle Trophy Wife Barbie. It's also the cover for my forthcoming book, shameless plug. And I think it's really important to think about Barbie memes. I think about them a lot. But this Barbie meme and Hoffmeyer's use of Barbies, I think is interesting because she situates the iconic status of Barbie as this foundational object for a dominant version of idealized white femininity. And, you know, I love that Amaya did this slide because for me, Barbie memes are my Roman Empire. I think it's coming up very nicely here. So Barbie memes really, especially since the Barbie movie and the Barbenheimer meme events, have all become a kind of central cultural temperature check on gender relations in mainstream culture. And I'm writing a piece about this right now, and I'm happy to talk about it a little bit in the questions. But what I love in particular about Hoffmeyer's memes is her intervention into idealized femininity through the absurdism of the antlers. So her account is always bringing up things like menstruation, PMS, aging bodies, ill bodies, bodies that just don't fit, excessive bodies, bodies with pleasure and desire attached to them. And she kind of uses the absurdism of the antlers, but also this sense of abjection, and really foregrounds for me the power of objection to resist dominant and oppressive regimes that outline how to do gender properly. And I think this like aligns with a very long history of women's art that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So the flip side of these Barbie memes are memes that uphold a dominant gendered regime. And here you find not only outright misogyny, but also, I would argue, a soft selling of conservative gendered regimes that seek to remove women from public space via appeals to motherhood as the highest calling. And I'm kind of referencing the Harrison Butker commencement speech and everything that followed from that last May. So these memes here are just from a simple poll I did on Pinterest about 6 months ago with the word trad wife, because I've been really curious about trad wife culture lately. The outcomes are incredibly regressive. Really, I'd love to share these slides with you because that one on the left is like it's a whole book could be written about that. But what you see is, you know, these appeals to intuitive motherhood, references to biblical kind of scripture, which shows the ties to a kind of certain Christian fundamentalism that is upheld within this vision. Obviously, you're seeing this kind of homesteader, very white centered vision of ideal femininity. But what I want to argue is that this is also tied to the sharing of misinformation around women and agency that runs parallel to more violent and strident forms of misogyny found in the manosphere. And so I do a lot of work these days on thinking about the relationship between trad wife culture as a bit of a soft selling of a much more pernicious misogynist bent in digital culture right now. The point about all of this in my research with trad wife culture is that the dominant regime upheld by current technology in this form is a heteropatriarchal, colonial, white supremacist capitalist vision. And these memes right here, but also the softer, more, lifestyle version of them are pretty clear in that. So if you look in the middle meme here, it's pitting two types of women against each other. The one on the right is the idealized one, because she's quite literally embracing motherhood and a kind of conservative version of femininity. She's also skinny, white, and blonde. And she's being pitted against a woman who is excessive, exceeding her clothing, not smiling, somehow, possibly an angry cat lady. But what's really disturbing is if you look at all the things that are added on the side, it's quite racist in the way that it's situating this woman. It's queer phobic, it's biphobic, it's a lot of things. It's really, really disturbing. And so I think we need to be very careful to put these things together and think about the gender regime that's being upheld by a lot of different actors that are all kind of moving towards the same thing. So what is that thing? I would argue, and I'm not going to go too much into this because I want to talk about the history, but I think a lot about Ballerina Farm, and I think she's a really great example of what's happening in culture right now around gendered regimes. So Ballerina Farm is a celebrity influencer who takes up, homesteading and trad wife life culture. She has about 8 kids. She's Mormon. She's married to the man that you can kind of see behind her in this picture as he's watching her dish out the food she's made for the family. He's a JetBlue airline heir. So clearly they have a lot of money to support this homesteading lifestyle that they're doing. She uses visual platforms extensively like Instagram and TikTok to push her brand. Her brand has a lot of products related to it now. You can buy Ballerina Farm protein powder, kind of like lifestyle boxes, etc. It's also very much in line with Christian and evangelical visions of gender roles that are emerging in conservative politics, and in particular, the Project 2025 playbook. So the playbook's first principle is to restore the family as a centerpiece of American life and protect our children. So this is an alarming statement for those of us who are familiar with alt-right discourse and the dog whistles that are contained within it. For me, it's not much different from the 14-word oath, the white supremacist terrorist 14-word oath advanced by David Lane, which states we must secure the existence of our people and the future of white children. I can't see them as very separate when I look at them in relationship to this image, because this is upholding a very specific version of American life, and that is one that is protecting the future of white children. So I think that the undertones are there, and this is the soft selling of it through Ballerina Farm's image. There's also dog whistles in Project 2025. Obviously, with Protect Our Children is very much a QAnon dog whistle for the fear of grooming, pedophilia, and how that's tied to all things non-right-wing culture. So this isn't new. This is part of our media histories, are part of our gendered regimes. It's just kind of taking a very disturbing center stage moment in American politics and across the world. So resistance also isn't new, but it's also really important. So I just want to take a minute before I get into the history to think a little bit about this meme. This meme is a reappropriation of white supremacist Nick Fuentes' gleeful comments on the eve of Trump's re-election, where he said on YouTube to his followers, "Your body, my choice forever." This itself was a reappropriation of the reproductive justice slogan, "My body, my choice," from the second wave of feminism. It's paired in this meme, which is a response to Fuentes, with a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi from the early 1600s, and it's a painting of an Old Testament scene of Judith beheading an invading general, but it's interpreted by many as Gentileschi's response to her own rape. So I think this is really interesting because a lot of different texts are being collapsed into each other here, and it's really just showing that there's a long history of working with representation in gendered regimes and the play or the interplay between that dominant kind of version and then these points of resistance and representation. All right. So, histories of gendered representation. I want to look through some histories now of how media regimes have positioned women and gender roles. And I'm going to start with the 19th century. So Griselda Pollock notes in her foundational 1985 essay, Modernity and the Spaces of Femininity, which I highly recommend. It's a must read. that the key visual texts of modernism in the late 1800s and early 1900s always situate women and their sexuality as forms of commercial exchange. So in this structure, men and male painters in particular have freedom to access all the spaces offered by modernity. All of these new spaces of modernity are on offer to men and male painters. Um, and this is represented or reflected in their paintings. This also coincides with the representation pretty much solely of women of a certain class, women who must work, often by selling their bodies to pay clients or artists. And so what we see then in women depicted on the canvas in modernity mirrors the forms of exchange between, say, painter and subject, and situates in the transactional. So what we see in the paintings of Manet is sex workers in a brothel, so the picture of Olympia, and we can talk about the history of Olympia and why this particular version is so important in the history of art in the Q&A, but also women who work at bars. So we're not seeing the same version of women that are upholding a vision of femininity. We're seeing working class women, and they are sites of exchange, both for painters, but also in kind of the capitalist moment. Sandra Gilman, in his essay from 1985, Black Bodies, White Bodies Towards an Iconography of Female Sexuality in the Late 19th Century Art, Medicine, and Literature, weaves a narrative between science, psychoanalysis, literature, and the paintings of Manet, among other artists, to demonstrate how the dominant discourse of that time collapsed together very dangerous stereotypes around white women sex workers and colonized Black women as both overly sexual, but also diseased. It's a really important article. I pretty much assign it in every class I ever teach. And what happens is he kind of explains how the fascination with Saartjie Baartman, or the Hottentot Venus, who was taken out of her community and brought into Europe to be paraded around and photographed and drawn because of her body composition as being so different from the idealized white feminine body, and in particular her buttocks, that she became kind of a spectacle. She died while she was being kind of paraded around Europe, and her remains were in Europe for a very, very long time. What Sandra Gilman argues is that there was desire and fascination around the Hottentot Venus that also mirrored the kinds of fascination that were being applied to sex workers, and in particular, them as diseased bodies. And so with Manet's painting here, we see the transposing of the fascination with Baartman's buttocks into the vision of Nana. So Nana as a sex worker is pretty much in the same genre of painting as Olympia, but now she's in profile and her buttocks are emphasized. And what happens is Nana is a novel about a sex worker who dies a horrible, gruesome death of syphilis. And it was a fascinating novel at the time. Everybody, it was a cause célèbre. And so what's happening here is there is a collapsing of these two. So the reason Gilman argues for this narrative that gets constellated in the late 19th century is men's fear of the other, which gets established as institutional knowledge through the use of technologies, through the appeal to science, as well as painting, visual art, and photography. So they're all reinforcing each other. Visual representation and literature are reinforcing what was happening in the scientific communities at that time. And together what they made up then is a gender regime with explicit fears around racialized, sexualized, and classed women, situating them as untrustworthy, duplicitous, dangerous, diseased, but also something of desire. And the fear and the fascination is that they were desired. And we can talk about that kind of that. Anyways, yeah. Okay, I'm going to fast forward to the 20th century and to film and classical Hollywood in particular. So this is the foundation for a lot of Western beauty ideals and image-based ephemera today. So this is Bette Davis. And we know, perhaps you know the 1980 song Bette Davis Eyes. So Bette Davis was known as a Hollywood actress with really beautiful eyes. And this is the film now Voyager. I highly recommend you watch it, where Bette Davis's character transforms from this kind of aging spinster under the thumb of her controlling mother into this worldly traveler who's stylish and beautiful and has a wonderful romance. And it's about her coming into her own. And you'll notice that she doesn't have glasses when she transforms. So in a really important essay from 1982 called Film and the Masquerade, Marianne Doan starts a passage of this essay with the phrase, "Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses." And this is the discussion I want to talk about with glasses today. So Doan argues, and I want to read this quote, but okay. The women who wear glasses, the woman who wears glasses constitutes one of the most intense visual cliches of the cinema. The image is a heavily marked condensation of motifs concerned with sexuality, knowledge, visibility and vision, intellectuality, and desire. The woman with glasses signifies simultaneously intellectuality and undesirability. But the moment she removes the glasses, this is a moment which is almost always shown in cinema and itself is linked to certain sensual qualities, she is transformed into spectacle or the very picture of desire. I'm going to just read a passage from the middle of this quote that kind of finishes the thought. The intellectual woman who looks and analyzes, and in usurping the gaze, she poses a threat to the entire system of representation. It is as if the woman had forcefully moved to the other side of the specular. So I want you to keep this assertion by Doan in mind that the woman in glasses is a central cinematic cliche that reinforces gendered values around desirability when we explore AI towards the end of the talk. So intellectuality in women equals undesirability. This is not acceptable in gendered regimes of representation because the role of women is to perform desirability. Without glasses, she can be received or perceived as the very picture of desire. So woman as spectacle. Spectacle and the spectacular are central to gender regimes of representation. And I guess one of the questions we want to ask is, what is the spectacular or the specular, the spectacle of women today, and what is it telling us about our ideological systems? More importantly for me is when the woman looks and sees more clearly with those glasses, she becomes an active participant in examining the regime. She does not perform spectacle, but assesses the system. She is using technology against the regime's expectations of women's roles in society. And in doing so, as Doan says, she poses a threat to the entire system of representation. So just like women as sexual agents pose a threat to the moral order of the 19th century, here, women as knowing subjects poses a threat against the role as desirable image objects. So there's an emergent theme here, I would argue, across the 19th and 20th centuries, and I would argue into the present, around women being represented as a vehicle for desire, and she cannot have desires or knowledge of her own. And that's a really, really big part of this regime, I would say. I think it's worth thinking about in the present moment how this dynamic plays out at the level of women's access to public space and agency. So in regressive spaces of conservative culture at the moment, there's an overvaluation of women as wives and mothers, and an active ideological and sometimes law-based push to remove them from the workforce, from public office, from reproductive autonomy, and alarmingly, more increasingly from voting. And so I think the recent SAVE bill is a really good example of this. So this line of thinking about women as spectacle and a threat to the and the threat of her visual agency brings us obviously, perhaps, to Laura Mulvey's essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. This is the most widely cited and influential feminist film studies text, even if it's actually not often read in its entirety. So the essay hinges on an argument that the mechanics of film technology are structured in a way to uphold a patriarchal gendered regime that she calls the male gaze. The camera, the director, the actor on film, everything in classical Hollywood is geared towards centering the vision of an active male viewer that has the power to look and direct the look of others, including us as an audience who are situated always as a male subject looking at women. And you can see this really obviously in these pictures. We're always situated behind the viewer, or as viewers behind the male, looking at the woman who's framed and often highlighted in very particular ways. But you know, I think we all know this pretty well by now. So this line of thinking, in this line of thinking, women are relegated as passive objects on display for male viewing pleasure. This initial theory has been applied to power dynamics and representation so widely that it's just a common part of our knowledge at this point. What is less common knowledge, or what gets less talked about in this, is that Mulvey herself was a filmmaker as well as a theorist and made feminist experimental films with her partner, Peter Woolen, including The Riddles of the Sphinx in 1977. So I note this because my favorite part of her essay is not about the male gaze, but it's about calling for a different approach to technology. In the closing of the essay, Mulvey advocates, in quotes, that women whose image has continually been stolen and used for this visual pleasure cannot view the decline of the traditional film form with anything much more than sentimental regret. She suggests that the more radical approaches to representation in film can actually shift the dominant hold of technology's gendered regime by freeing, in her words, the look of the camera into its materiality in time and space, which breaks the illusion set out by classical Hollywood cinema and enables our passionate detachment as viewers. In doing so, the tactics of spectacle and woman as spectacle that rely on a certain form of visuality are ruptured and encourage criticality. So for me, I love this because it's very Brechtian, it's very Benjaminian. I think it's really important for us in the current moment to return to the Frankfurt School and to the Birmingham School for how they talked about gendered regimes of technology and what we can do to kind of resist them through materiality and also through the upending of technology. So that's my plug there. So what does it mean to free the look of representational technologies into the materiality of time and space? It means very different things for different moments in time. For women artists in the late 1800s, it meant painting what they had access to. And the only thing they had access to was the domestic. So what's really great about that Pollock essay that I argued, or I quoted earlier, is that she argues that women artists were not actually interested in painting quaint domestic scenes, which the history of art tends to think they were. They just couldn't, as respectable women, explore any of the urban spaces of modernity that their male counterparts could access. They had no option but to paint domestic scenes. So they worked with what they were able to. And what I think is, it's no accident, thanks to Amaya for picking out these two particular paintings, these women look really bored. I think that's woven into the narrative of the paintings by women at this time. That was how they could resist, was by making these look like fairly tedious experiences, if we look at them in a very particular way. So for early 20th century modernists like Hannah Höch, there was more latitude. And we see in her work the use of radical collage techniques, which themselves are playing with materiality to upend the art world, which was happening at that time. She used those particular techniques to critique the concept of the new woman emerging in Weimar Germany. So she's freeing the visual art technologies that she's been afforded into different forms of materiality to consider the relationship between time and space. Like Höch, many women artists from modernity onwards employed Dadaist and Surrealist uses of art to advance alternative representations of gender and to kind of upend and trouble what gender can and should look like. So here from the world of experimental film is Maya Deren's work. Maya Deren was a bridge between early modernist surrealism in Europe and the American avant-garde in the post-war. She kind of is this kind of hinge between them. And we see here, I would say, arguing echoes of Höch in her film, Meshes of the Afternoon, where, we have these almost like collaged face images where we have the cloaked figure with a mirror. We see women's faces as being interrupted by everyday objects in an almost collage-like fashion. There's a displacement of women as willing visual subjects into something resistant, refusing to be fixed by a male gaze. They're absurd, they're uncanny, they're abject. And so I want to just take a moment to show you a couple of examples from my forthcoming book where I link feminist counterculture memes in the present to earlier moments of feminist art. So here we can see Cindy Sherman's performance art piece, Untitled Film Stills, from the late 1970s. And very much I see the echoes of this in feminist memes where we have a similar performance of femininity, but it's interrupted by visual text that kind of allows for criticality. In the work here of Annie Sprinkle, Anatomy of a Pinup Photo is a really famous performance piece by Annie Sprinkle from the 1980s. And I would argue it's a prototype for memes. It looks like a meme. And for me, I'm really interested in the way that what she does here with the pinup piece is being replicated by accounts such as Not Thirst Traps, which does the performance of female desire, but always interrupts it with certain appeals to thinking about what goes into making that image, but also the level of state of her own mental health as she performs this vision of femininity. It's a really fascinating account for that. Also just quickly thinking about Barbara Kruger's use of collage as a form of resistance and the use of Kruger's images in protest posters, and then seeing how that's showing up in contemporary protest posters like this one for voting in 2016. And so I do think that there's a lot of echoes happening that are kind of fascinating. Alice Bucknell notes that the artistic lineage of memes is spun out of some of 20th century art's most revolutionary ideas. The examples that I've shown here are artifacts of these artists making a sense of living in precarious times with the technologies available to them. And I think that AI images are probably a part of this lineage too. And I want to sort of keep exploring that. It's new to me, but I'm beginning to think about it. So we'll take a joy break for a second and look at what I think is the best thing to come out of AI, which is putting cats in ridiculous scenarios that give me a lot of joy. So here is one of the first times I started to pay attention to AI was when I saw this mer kitty, or as the artist our Shaquille notes, it's a purr cat. But the purr cat and the bee kitty, I think, are just delightful. Okay, let's look at AI. The good, the bad, and the very ugly. So if you Google AI girls on Instagram, this is what you get. We're just seeing, it comes as a surprise. It's very much a very particular kind of able, skinny bodied, idealized white woman kind of version of femininity with large breasts in different variations, but it's variations of the same. I'm not going to go into too much about the bad necessarily, but one of the accounts that fascinates me the most that I could probably write a whole book on is Planet AI. Planet AI basically just does prompts and it wants to do it as comparative versions of countries. And this is just deeply based in stereotypes. And I also find it deeply colonial. And so this is countries as stereotypes, and I will let you make of it what you will. But I think if we were to unpack these, you would see an alarming amount of problematic and colonial based stereotypes within here. So we can go back to them and talk about it if you want in the Q&A, but also countries as demigods. So it's interesting to me, there's a lot of these. And, you know, AI is being used extensively for fantasy images. And I understand the impulse because it does render them quite interestingly. But in the countries as demigods, you'll also notice that countries in the global south, countries that are not Western European countries, are animalizing or doing this kind of conflation between body of, you know, country, male in country as animalistic. And I think that there's a lot we could unpack there in terms of gendered regimes and racism, which feels kind of overt to me in these images. Okay, what I want to do, that's the very ugly. I want to show you some trends across different times that I've used prompts in different AI technologies. So often when you say make a feminist meme or feminism, in most image generators, you will get a version of Rosie the Riveter. So somehow that iconic image from World War II has in AI systems cemented itself as feminism. If you put alpha male or alpha meme or anything like that, especially in Midjourney, you will get this collapsing of men and animal. And I think that's largely because, you know, Midjourney is used for fantasy fiction fan arts, and a lot of fantasy fiction does equate men with beasts as part of its kind of genre. And so I'm not surprised that we see that. But if we take a closer look at these two that come from Stable Diffusion, it's really obvious to me, again, they're doing Rosie the Riveter here, but she's also looking a little bit like Soviet Russia social realism. So I don't really know what to make of that. All AI, I was showing this to my kids last night, AI can't spell feminist. It's not very good with text, but feminist gets spelled in the most hilarious ways. I'm trying to figure out why her face is scratched out. I can't quite figure out what the image prompt was there, but you can tell from these two that every time that AI generates feminist, it has in its brain probably the words strong and woman. And that's why this woman is carrying weights, because she's a strong woman, right? So, I mean, this is kind of a failure of nuance, but it is what we get. These are different. These are from earlier, from about maybe last June. And you can tell because the hands are a hot mess. And, you know, we've sort of moved on from that with AI image generation. But at certain moments, if you try and get an image of misogyny, it won't load. And I think there's stop gaps, there's stop words in certain generators that won't let you see certain things. And one of them is misogyny. Again, we've got a very similar looking generic brunette, feminist, white woman. But we also get angry hordes of women, okay? Women feminists here in these memes obviously are women who wear glasses. They're not perfectly skinny. They're something else, and therefore they're intellectual and undesirable. Here we've got a more palatable version of feminism. These are attractive women, but they're in that mass concentration. So I'm curious about why it keeps showing these like protest boards and what that says about kind of the cultural temperature. Feminist professor memes are always going to have glasses, and they all tend to look the same. There's not a lot of variation on them. Midjourney is often more fantastical. If you just put professor, you will get men. If you get feminist philosopher, it'll be a philosopher man with a horde of women behind him. So this, Jen Craft just glitched and was like, there's no philosopher that's a woman, it has to be a man. I'm joking, but this is kind of the silliness. Trad wife is very fascinating because I've just shown you what trad wife means in a North American vernacular. The generators won't see it that way. They haven't picked up on that, and so they will kind of stereotype in ways that are suggesting, non-white traditional wife roles, or it will be very much tied to the domestic. So if we go into AI, I typed in feminist AI and got the account AI feminism. I wouldn't say this is feminist. I think that it's showing us that fantastical, that collapsing. There's a little bit of a neocoloniality here. There's a lot going on that we can unpack, but it's not feminist. So let's talk a little bit about the good, because those are sort of, in my mind, the ugly. I'm interested in how we can see AI working with the surreal. I don't want to go over. Hold on. I'll go a little fast here. So there's a couple of accounts that I really love. This one is AI in the kitchen, and I think it's very successful in working with the surrealist impulse to take on gendered regimes. I also love Funky Nanas, and we'll talk about both of them a little bit. AI in the kitchen, these pieces really stand out for me from AI in the kitchen, especially the one on the right with the almost trad wife looking dress, but this very abject, like what the cost of the house is for the soul of the body of the woman here, I think is really profound. I think these are really beautiful AI images. I love Funky Nanas because it brings a lot of joy. It's the idea of the aging woman's body. And it's just mythical, mystical, beautiful, sparkly, joyful. Polly in Wonderland, I think, is really excelling in its ability to produce visceral, material, sensual images that just kind of stop you in your tracks and allow us to feel something. It's also a really fun and varied account. So we have things that, the crown of fingers is fairly abject and unsettling. There's a lot of absurdism in these images. It really is the best for me of Dadaism and surrealism in AI form. The Alice in Wonderland kind of Alice the Looking Glass here is a pretty haunting and exciting image. So these are things that I'm curious about thinking further about in relationship to the structures of gender regimes that we've been talking about. Polly in Wonderland also does Barbie memes and thinking about motherhood and the cost of motherhood. So I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about, to close, the limits of data visualization in AI where they appear is, I think, where the interesting questions arise. So what it does show and what it does not show, I think, are where we want to spend our energies. The bad, the good, whatever, they all have their limits. What is being shown? What is missing? Where are the things that are being erased in these histories? And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that in the Q&A. I think AI, like all tech, can easily uphold regimes of discrimination. And so I think we should resist uncritically adopting AI in ways that uphold oppressive social structures, but we also need to map out where the resistance is showing up. I think the takeaway is that technology as resistance is always on the table. We just need to experiment with it and make it our own. And these examples from Misty Labs are interesting because it's doing this fantastical, surreal, candy-colored kind of bimbo feminism thing that's so interesting, but it's doing it in a way that makes us stop and think. The beauty of images is when they make us stop and think, because then we're in the realm of criticality. So this one here on the right is a man versus bear meme, which is a kind of popular feminist event from last year, but it's done in AI. So I want to end with a consideration of Legacy Russell's 2020 book, Glitch Feminism, which outlines how we can be figures of resistance through the concept of the technological glitch, or as she claims, that which is an error, a mistake, a failure to function. So for Russell, gender, race, sexuality, and disability are cogs within the machine of society and culture. And because of that, they're part of the technological regime. For Russell, this is evidenced by the very fact of how we get positioned by technologies, and importantly, how we fail and are failed by systems and culture. Through the act of of failing and being failed, Russell suggests we access sites of refusal and dissent. Glitch feminism, then, in quote, demands an occupation of the digital as a means of world building. And I love this image because this shows me, in my mind, world building through rupture, which I think is the most important tool we have. This also aligns well with Mulvey's closing argument that systems upheld by representational technologies must be attacked because from there emerges alternative ways of seeing and representing. For Mulvey, this alternative leaves, in her words, the past behind without rejecting it, transcending outworn or oppressive forms and daring to break with normal, pleasurable expectations in order to conceive a new language of desire. I'm interested in this new language of desire that emerges as an alternative to dominant forms of representation and breaks with normal, pleasurable expectations. It does so not to repudiate visual pleasure or technologies, but imagines what it could look like if we moved away from those outworn logics and into something different, more inspired, full of potential of other worlds and ways of being. Thank you.